Okay, I think it's time now. So we will start. So I will briefly introduce the speakers. So I just want to say hello, everyone, and good morning to those in China. Sorry, good afternoon for those in China, and good morning for those in Europe. So I just want to say thank you very much for attending the second week of our 9th Stirling Annual August Translation Studies Research Event 2022. So today we will have two talks delivered by two distinguished professors, Professor David Johnston and Professor Miguel Benito Crispo. Sorry for my bad pronunciation in Spanish. For those of you who do not know me, so my name is Saihong Li, and I'm the person who organizing this event. And I supervise a few PhD students in translation and interpreting studies. Digital humanities are the heart of my research. So drawing on empirical research, I have studied translation studies from sociological and psychological perspective. And so far, perhaps you all know I have produced a substantial body of research analyzing political discourse translation, tourism, that include museum translation, and food translation studies. And I sincerely hope this series of events will be a source of fascinating discoveries for all our students and colleagues who are passionate about translation and language studies. And I also hope that we all can share our knowledge, our feelings, and our individual perspectives, and that everyone will be inspired by the two talks today. So for those of you who would like to have your certificate of attendance for each talk, please contact our event coordinator, Yuchen Chen. There he's waving at us, and also Yayuan Liu, who is there in the room. So I would like to express our greatest thanks to Yu Chen and also Yayuan for co-organizing the event. So it's our great honor to have the two professors here. So because the first talk will be delivered by Professor David Johnston. So will introduce him first. The title of Professor David Johnston's talk is on translating the dead, solidarity, and the afterlife. David Johnston is a professor of translation studies in the Center for Translation and Interpreting at Queen's University, Belfast. He has published extensively on the relationship between theory, practice, and ethics in the translation process, particularly in terms of translation for the stage, and has given invited lectures and papers to audience in 28 different countries. He's also a multi-award winner translator for the stage, described as the most innovative translator of Spanish Golden Age drama in the 21st century. He's also an elected member of the Academia Europe. Without further ado, I think I will leave the floor to Professor David Johnston. So it's our great honor to have you. So the floor is yours. And thank you very much. So I will start. Yeah.
Can you put my slides up?
And then I will.
Brilliant. Thank you, Saihong. Thank you very much indeed for your kind introduction and your very kind invitation to Stirling. Thank you for coming along on a rainy day in Scotland. I have my phone with me here, not because I'm expecting an urgent call, but to reassure you that I am aware of time. So the time isn't endless. This will stop at the allotted moment. But thank you very much for coming along. It's a great pleasure to be sharing a platform with you as well, Miguel Angel. It seems to be a really gloomy set of talks, doesn't it? The dead and then the pandemic. So while we sit in this overheated room talking about death and the pandemic, we'll try to make it as interesting and as relevant to what you're doing as possible. Translation studies as a discipline is an incredibly healthy state at the moment. All sorts of people are doing all sorts of work into a whole variety of different topics. That's very important. It spreads the discipline. But it seems to me that it's also important that we remember the discipline that we're coming from. What is not just translation studies? Because when a discipline becomes too concerned with itself, it starts to die. Look what's happened to modern languages in the United Kingdom and Ireland as a closed-in discipline that has begun to wither, to die, to attract less interest, to generate less scholarly concern. So it's important that we always bear in mind, no matter what you're interested in translation, no matter what your subject is, and we all do fascinating things, it's really important to bear in mind that translation itself, the mode that we call translation, the cultural practice that we call translation, is a really important way of thinking about the world. I'd like to think about it in terms of absence and presence today, partly because this is a hybrid event. So we're both present and absent to each other. And the interplay of presence and absence is something that we've all got very used to during the pandemic. We've been present to each other. We've also been absent to each other as well, so that it seems a fitting time to begin to think about what is translation present to? Because of course, when we think about the act of translation or the product of translation, what we're always doing is creating something from absence, the absence of the original text, the presence of a new one. So you can see that presence and absence becomes a defining factor of what translation is about. When you look at presence and absence in political terms, and we start thinking about inclusion and exclusion, then translation is deeply concerned with that as well. Translation rests upon a politics of recognition, recognizing group identity, individual identity, in the face of the attempt to pass that identity over into that of another language or another culture. So there's a political concern of presence and absence in translation as well. To interrupt myself for a second, I should say, I'm very happy for you to keep these slides so that if you want a copy of the slides, either those of you who are online in China or those of you who are in the room, just ask Saihong and she'll be able to give them to you. If you don't like the stuff that's on them, there are some lovely pictures. So at least there will be something there that you will be able to enjoy once I've finished. So presence and absence has a political weight in translation as well. But presence and absence, are they not the defining ontological categories of our lives? And by ontological, what I mean is that which determines our being, our human beingness. Do we not live most intensely through conditions of presence and absence? And if translation is centrally concerned with presence and absence, then what is the relationship between translation as a way of interpreting and representing the world, of being in the world, and our own ontological condition as human beings? So what I want to do today is to bring translation right back to first principles, if you like, to ask, what does translation do? Why is it important, not just to us studying translation, not just to us in terms of our individual topics and our themes, because they're all important, but what underlies that? Why should everyone be interested in translation? And I'll do that through discussing the whole idea of presence and absence. Because of course, presence and absence is most vivid in our lives in terms of the people that we have lost, in terms of the dead. And cultures throughout the world, my Irish culture not least, are concerned to find ways of negotiating the apparent borders, the apparent unsurpassable borders of death and life. Here's one of these ways. This is a film by the Spanish filmmaker Pedro Almodovar. It's called Volver, which means to return. And in it, the opening scene, it should remind you perhaps of Qing Ming, of tomb sweeping. So this is, translation very rarely uses the word universal. It's a dangerous word because whenever you find there is something universal, there's always something that contradicts that. So it's a word we're very careful with. But this is certainly a widespread phenomenon of how we relate to the dead. Look at the, so here are the dead, but look at the flowers in the scene. Look at the color of the actress's jumper. This is a way of bringing death and life together into a sort of, well, let's call it community at the moment, because we are in constant contact with our dead in our memories. And of course, translation itself is a way of commemorating. We translate what we have lived into memories. The Day of the Dead itself centrally concerns Mexico and much of Spanish America. And in the Day of the Dead, which is on the 1st and 2nd of November, people dress up as skeletons, but with plenty of flowers and colors. One of the central figures is La Catrina, who you see here, the lady skeleton, who symbolizes both death and life. Symbolizes apparent, not symbolizes, brings together into contact apparent opposites. Is that not a really good working definition of translation? That it brings together into communion, into contact, into encounter, into new forms, what seem to be apparent opposites. The Spanish poet and playwright, Lorca, who died in 1936, begins to develop a theory of art, which comes from our contact, from our commemoration of the dead, from our contact with the awareness of death. He calls that theory of art duende. And he means by that any art form which produces that sort of shiver when you think about your own dead, when you think about our own death. He says this: elsewhere, death is an ending. It comes and they close the curtains, not in Spain. In Spain, they open them. Many Spaniards live indoors until the day they die and are carried into the sun. The dead in Spain are more alive than anywhere else on earth. The dead are alive. Their profile cuts like the edge of a barber's razor. Now, if I were talking about translation, I would say that as well. Translation revivifies the dead. Translation brings the dead to life, but in a way in which their aliveness connects with us sharply, deeply. So we're actually talking about a theory of translation here. Throughout the history of art, literature in general, there was always an attempt to revive the past. This in terms of Irish revivalism. But look at China now. Look at the revival or the attempts to revive classical Chinese writing, Shichu, not least among them, so that the contact with the past has an important impact upon the present. Where have we come from? What does our past mean to us? And especially, how much past do I carry within myself? In this article, Fintan de Bruin talks about Irish revivalism. He talks about the common feature of all of these revivals: Gothic, Renaissance, Greek, Islamic, evangelical revivals. Since the 1980s, I would talk as well about the revival of interest in classical Chinese literature. The common feature of all of these revivals is the basic desire to renegotiate the present by means of a radical synthesis with the past. Is that not what translation does? Every time we translate a text from the past, are we not renegotiating the present through contact with the past, but not just through contact with the past, because we're not historians. We make it live. We bring about a radical synthesis with the past. And we know that that idea is contradictory in terms. The Latin word revivere, to live again, as Fintan says, appears to make no sense except to the imagination. So we're in the area of the created relation, which is the work of the poet and of the translator, not the historian, not the literary critic. Whatever our relationship with the dead is, we have a sense of responsibility to the past, which we project into the future. This wonderful book by Robert Pogue Harrison, The Dominion of the Dead, he says this: in the human realm, the dead and the unborn are native allies, so much so that from their posthumous abode, wherever it may be, and I'll talk about that in a second, the dead hound the living with guilt, dread, and a sense of responsibility, obliging us by whatever means necessary to take the unborn into our care, to keep the story going. What is translation but the story of us? If we come back to the basic principles of translation, to translation and our ontology, translation and the depths of our beingness, what is translation other than the global but not globalizing story of us? And he ends up by saying, one day the science of genetics may decode the secrets of this custodianship, but meanwhile we may rest assured that there exists an allegiance between the dead and the unborn, of which we, the living, are merely the ligature. Ligature meaning a bond, something that ties together. Let's take this idea of a ligature. Let's take the idea of us being translators as forming a ligature between that which was and that which will be, because that's what we do. Let's think about what that might mean. One of the key works of the European 20th century is André Malraux's Le Musée Imaginaire. Translates into English sometimes as the imaginary museum, but more frequently as the museum without walls. And it's interesting because, of course, the pandemic has led us to visit more places online so that we're experiencing more a virtual connection with works of art, theatre, and so on. But theatre, while during the pandemic, it was saying, yes, this has changed theatre for good. We will never perform theatre the same way again. In fact, theatre is moving back to its traditional modes of performance because people like being together. People value the presence of other people. So again, the act of presence is key. In the Imaginary Museum, Malraux talks about all of the works of art in the world as existing in a space to which we all have access and contact. And he talks, for anyone who's interested in what art might mean in our lives, he talks about art in a way which I find very persuasive. He says, like love, art is a passion, not simply a pleasure. Why is it a passion? It's an existential passion because art denies our nothingness. Art is anti-destiny. If it's our destiny to die and to disappear, then art leaves something behind. Where does translation fit into that? Well, translation is the tool that holds the imaginary museum together. Translation is the mode of writing and the mode of thinking which allows cultural transmission across the globe. Global, but not globalizing. And that's a really important distinction. So when you sit down with your friends who are studying business and who say to you, you're doing translation, what's that about? You're starting to get some answers, that it's about something which lies deep within the human spirit. It lies deep within human resilience. Now, of course, when Malraux begins to talk about the imaginary museum, he's thinking, we all have access to photography now. We all have access to cheap reproductions. And I remember as a student, being really excited by buying posters. First time I moved into a flat, by buying posters for my walls. Everyone who's ever been to a student party has been to a house which has a reproduction of Van Gogh's The Sunflowers. It's an obligatory reproduction to have on a student wall. And Malraux is asking, what is the relationship between art in the globe and photography? Isn't that an interesting question for translation? Because all too often we're accused of not photographing enough the original, of departing from it. So what are the implications for translation in terms of what Walter Benjamin called the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction? Now, he wrote this in the 20s, and he begins to give us some clues as to the relationship between translation and creativity. Because a work of art is defined by its creative response to the world, but translation isn't. And should we think of translation as creative? Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, who I'm sure you know from The Task of the Translator, I'm sure you have sat down to read The Task of the Translator and you have thought, I can't make much sense of this, because he is a very much of a poetic philosopher who is really difficult to read, especially in English. So he says this, what is aura? He's talking about a photograph doesn't have aura, but a work of art does. What is aura? And he defines it as a peculiar web of space and time, the unique manifestation of a distance, however near it may be, to follow, while reclining on a summer's noon, the outline of a mountain range on the horizon or a branch. It's almost like a Chinese painting, isn't it? You can visualize this, which casts its shadow on the observer until the moment or the hour partakes of their presence. That is to breathe in the aura of these mountains, of this branch. It's a Chinese poem. It's a Chinese painting. And aura attaches to something which captures what is present at a particular space and time. But present, although it is in that particular space and time, it is absent from us. It is not ours. We can only look at it. So we're getting into the whole idea of both the joy of art and the pain of art. The pain of art, we cannot possess it. It cannot be ours. It lasts longer than us. But that lasting longer than us is, of course, the area in which we as translators work. Now, the way that Benjamin thinks about photography as being a capturing of the forms of a work of art, but not its aura, have implications, of course, for translation. It suggests that any reproduction is less. That is an idea that is contested more and more throughout the 20th century. If you're interested in photography, then in a sense, one of the areas that you might want to look at as a cognate area for translation is photography. And the people that I would recommend that you look at, Susan Sontag, Roland Barthes, but especially this man, John Berger. Because John Berger is probably, was probably, he died in 2015, was probably the most important critic of art, the most important ethical philosopher, the most important Marxist writer of the second half of the 20th century in English. And he says this, and where he talks about photograph, think of it as a translation, because a photograph is a chosen translation of something outside itself. The true content of a photograph is invisible, for it derives from a play not with form, but with time. So here he agrees with Benjamin. One might argue that photography is as close to music as to painting, add in, as to translation. I have said that a translation, photograph, bears witness to a human choice being exercised. This choice is not between photographing X and Y. What book will I translate? No, that's not the choice of a translator. The choice is, what book will I translate at this moment or that moment? Between photographing at X moment or at Y moment. The objects recorded in any photograph, from the most effective to the most commonplace, carry approximately the same weight, the same conviction. What varies is the intensity with which we are made aware of the poles of absence and presence. Between these two poles, photography finds its proper meaning. The most popular use, so I'm keeping on getting this little notice here, the most popular use of the photograph is as a memento of the absent. Do any of you have a photograph in your flat, in your room, in your wallet, in your purse? Why do you carry a photograph? It's a memento, a reminder of someone or something that isn't there. What is translation? When we come to this most basic human experience, what we are providing in a translation is a record of the absent for that which is present at the moment. Berger, there he is in 2003, 12 years before his death. And he says this in an interview in a French newspaper. And he relates the way in which we live in the present to, if you like, a constraint of human life. People everywhere under very different conditions are asking themselves, where are we? The question is to do with time, not place. What are we living through? Where are we being taken? What have we lost? How to continue without a plausible vision of the future? Is this not so true today as well? Why have, then for us as individuals, why have we lost any view of what is beyond a lifetime? Where does our work go beyond our work? Where do our lives go beyond our lives? It sounds, at any moment, I could ask you to sing a hymn and we would have some sort of religious service. I am not religious at all. I have no religious belief. I'm talking about a different form of afterlife, of a different form of survival, a different form of quality of life. The great poet W.H. Auden, you will know W.H. Auden as the author of Cathay. A modernist poet of the early 20th century. It was really Auden who, well, did two things: rediscovered Chinese poetry for the West, but also in rediscovering it, created his own version of Chinese poetry for the West. And he says very, very simply, if we don't take seriously this idea of ourselves being a ligature between presence and absence, between the dead and the living, if we don't think of ourselves as renegotiating the apparent boundaries between past and present, then our lives become smaller. He says quite simply, through art, we are able to break bread with the dead. And without communion with the dead, a fully human life is impossible. He uses deliberately religious terms, breaking bread, religion, but he's not talking about religious experience. He's talking about the contact and the quality of contact that we get through art. Art is not for high-flown literary critics. Art is not for aesthetic essays. Art is to connect everyone with some sort of flow beyond ourselves. So in that way, art plugs us in to a tradition. When we think of art, we are very often told this painting was painted in 1745, and you go, ooh. But that painting connects with us in a different way. So what we're not looking at is the sense of time that belongs to the historian. Translation is not about history. What we're looking at is the feeling of being human that comes from the past into us through our memories, through our emotions, through our knowledge of what the past was in human terms. This is really important. Michel de Certeau, who is a French Jesuit, who was a French Jesuit priest, really important writer in terms of understanding history and the social practices of everyday life. He says this: historiography takes for granted the fact that it's become impossible to believe in the presence of the dead. The dead are gone. We know that. But the presence of the dead has organized, and as we saw in my early slides, organizes the experience of entire civilizations. We're conditioned by our dead. We're parents, grandparents, lovers. We're conditioned by the presence of our dead. And he distinguishes then between historiography and tradition. So what translation is concerned with is not time as experienced in terms of historiography, but times as experienced as a flow, as a tradition of which we are part. Historiography says past, present. There's a divide. We look backwards. Tradition says there's a flow of which we are part. So where he talks about the distinction between the present and the past as being part of historiography, he also says, but as human beings, we absorb ourselves, we reabsorb ourselves into a flow, into a feeling of being human, into the presence and the perceived absence now of everything that has gone before us. That's the imaginary museum. That's the museum without walls. That is what translation transmits across the globe. So coming back to Walter Benjamin, he says this, and this is really interesting. Do you not think? He says, the notion of, he's talking about afterlife. We all know the shorthand, don't we? Where Walter Benjamin talks about translation provides the afterlife of literature, of the work. And he says this, nobody ever quotes this bit. It should be considered with completely unmetaphorical objectivity. What's that mean? Like everyone else, like most people, when I was young, I tried to be religious. I was born in Ireland, I had no choice. I tried to be religious. And what put me off in the end, the reason why I'm not religious today, I couldn't imagine what the afterlife was like. I couldn't imagine. What is it like? What form will I be in the afterlife? What form will I take? What presence, what bits of me will survive? What bits won't? What if all the bad bits survive and all the good bits go? And as you get older, you realize you have more bad bits than good bits. So the afterlife becomes even more terrifying. We can't imagine the afterlife. Just as Fintan de Bruyn said, we can't imagine what it is to bring back to life, to revive. So what does it mean to talk about the afterlife of a text? How does translation actually secure that afterlife? Well, Benjamin gives us a few clues. And, you know, for what it's worth, I think this man was probably the most connected thinker and philosopher of the first half of the 20th century. Wonderful, wonderful thinker. Not easy. I'm not suggesting you should rush out and read all of his stuff immediately, because as we say in Ireland, it will do your head in. It will prove very difficult. He begins to talk, when he's talking about the survival of the work of art, about resting truths and moving truths. What does that mean? Well, look at any work of art, and it has certain truths. Notice he's not using the word truth. Truths, multiple, simultaneous, very often contradictory, in the way that we are the embodiment of contradictory elements. Certain truths move. There are things in a work of art which still mean to us today. We can still identify the importance. We can still identify with the value and the impact of what that work is doing. But certain truths rest with it. They're gone. They're gone. We lose them. So it becomes important to recognize that when we're translating a classical text, bits of it will work and bits of it won't work for the contemporary audience, especially when it's in translation. I invite you to think about, for example, Shichu on the international stage. Probably one of the world's great dramatic forms, and yet not very well known outside China. What failure of translation is happening there? What are the resting truths of Sichu that stay with it in its place? And what are the moving truths? For that reason, I'm still with Benjamin. He says this, and this, for my mind, for my money, is the key, I suppose, definition of tragedy, of translation. Translation passes through continua of transformation, not abstract ideas of identity and similarity, continua of transformation. Now that's a phrase, a continuum of transformation, that has been hijacked today by scientists, by business leaders, especially business leaders. Google continuum of transformation, and you will get corporate companies all around the world telling you that this is what they do. But a continuum of transformation is a key idea, because what it tells us is that as a text travels, as a memory travels, it travels with us. It's a continuum, but it changes all the time. So that absence we can now begin to feel is not an unmoving, fixed reality. It's something that we carry and shape with us as we live, so that our relationships with that which is absent vary, develop, and change as we translate them. Now, if you look at English modernism, you get a totally different view of the relationship between time past and time present. I don't know if you recognize this writer. Free lunch to anyone who does. Free lunch and free dinner. Free trip to Ireland for anyone. This is T.S. Eliot, author of The Wasteland and so on. And this comes from an important essay called Tradition and the Individual Talent. And he talks about dead writers are remote from us because we incorporate them into ourselves. They become us. They become us. We find that offensive in translation, don't we? We find that an act of appropriation. When we remember our dead, when we experience, I think the Peony Pavilion is one of the world's great works of art. When we go to watch or listen to or see the Peony Pavilion, we don't say, haha, this is mine now. We travel into it as well. But modernism, of which W.H. Auden was a part, is about making the past part of the present as well. You find that in this, you find this idea in Eliot's poem, Burnt Norton, which is the 4 quartets. That's the house in the background, that's Burnt Norton. And very, very simply, the poem begins. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. We don't believe that, do we? If we're translators, we can't believe that. Our job when we translate is to find the moving truths from whatever we're translating that travel across into our sphere now. So that in his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, what Eliot ends up saying is this: tradition should positively be discouraged. Novelty is better than repetition. In other words, if you're going to perform Shichu today, it should be by people who record pop songs to it and stick them up online. Now that seems to me to be okay. And I've listened to some of these pop songs based on Shichu that are online, and some of them are great. But we need to remember that Shichu itself also has its own, I suppose, demands on our time, demands on our hearts, and demands on our minds, because it's a key element, if you're Chinese especially, of who you are. The whole idea, or the modernist idea of making it new, is key to the, I suppose, what you might call the British modernist tradition. Make it new, not repetition, not tradition, but whatever we write, make it new now. Now, that takes us, if we're interested in this point of view and you want to begin to justify it, that takes us into the whole realm of adaptation. How far can we adapt something so as to recreate something not of the work of art itself, but of the impact of the work of art? It's a little bit like if you miss your grandfather, you pay somebody to dress up as him and create that air, that aura of a loving grandfather in the room. So you pay an actor, please just sit there, you'll be dressed as my grandfather. What we want is the aura of our grandfather. But there's something else which is much, much more important than making something new for the moment. As translators, we can do that. And a lot of good translation work does that. Cathay is brilliant. Here's a poem from 1551. Let's go back to the 16th century. Here's a poem from 1551. It's by Joachim du Bellay, and it's called Les Antiquités de Rome, the Antiquities of Rome. Joachim du Bellay lived in Paris, and all of his life, he dreamt about going to Rome. He thought, Rome must be wonderful. Rome must be great. He read all about Rome. And in 1551, he went to Rome. And what he found were the ruins of Rome. It was, this I think is the first modern poem. It's a poem in the West anyway. It's a poem which tells us about the pain of absence, of going to a Rome and finding Rome not there. Interestingly, it was the last piece of literature to be translated by the Irish poet, Seamus Heaney. And that's du Bellay in the picture, not Seamus Heaney. The poem begins in Heaney's translation. You who arrive to look for Rome in Rome, and can in Rome no Rome you know discover. These palaces and arches I read over, and ancient walls are Rome. Now Rome's a name. We can't be content with just names, can we? If we're translators, we translate more than a name. We translate the human life of that name. The poem goes on. And yet this Rome is Rome's one monument. Rome alone could conquer Rome. And the one element of constancy in Rome is the ongoing seaward rush of Tiber, O world of flux, where time destroys what's steady as the rocks, and what resists time is what's ever flowing. The Tiber is the river that runs through Rome. So du Bellay looks at Rome and he says, it's gone. My imagination, it's gone. It's like when somebody sends you a photograph of somewhere and you go to see that place and it's not the same as in the photograph because reality duplicated isn't real. Reality is what we interpret. And du Bellay looks at the river and says, but the river's real and it's keeping on flowing. So that the flow of the river represents a resistance to time, a tradition, a flow, something that we can identify as connecting with them and us. That flow of the human, that flow that negotiates the apparent borders of presence and absence. That's what we do for a living as translators. Slavoj Žižek. No talk is ever complete without something from Slavoj Žižek. If any of you are interested in cinema, his book, Jacques Lacan, in Hollywood and Out, is a wonderful analysis of cinema. He says this, the most succinct definition of historicism is historicity minus the unhistorical kernel of the real. What he means by that, because that's quite puzzling, but what he means by that is the historical, looking at history, doesn't give you the sense of what it really meant to be a human being. The unhistorical kernel of the real, that's us. We are real in this room. If a history of Stirling University is ever written, we won't be in it. But we're very real in this moment. And what will that reality of our contact, what might it lead to? Where might it go? So for Žižek, there's a nostalgia for the past, to find the absent and to bring it into, let's use Auden's word, communion with the present. to bring it into some sort of meaningful contact. Do you not see in there a translator's task? Because when we're translating, this is John Dewey, a philosopher of art. He says very, very simply, in an experience, I'm watching the time. He says, in an experience, flow is from something to something. In other words, when you're translating, what do you look at? Do you look at the text in front of you and say, I'm translating this text? Because this text is all that's left. Or do you think that there's something absent in the text that you might be able to reconnect with? Is there any flow within that text that you can reconnect with? Because that text is in ruins. Texts that come to us from the past come broken and they come in ruins. They don't come complete. So that when we translate a classical piece of literature, when we translate a text from a very different culture, it's broken. It doesn't work if we translate at the level of text. We need to translate at the level of flow. The flow between the human reality of that text and the human reality that we are able to provide as well. A line is a dot that went for a walk. This is from Klimt, the painter. And he talks about finding what Benjamin would have called a truth within the work of art. And finding that as a dot, there's something here I can identify with. There's a dot of contact. And he talks in his art about taking that dot and developing it, turning it into a line on the page. That's what we do as translators. And I'm going to finish by giving you one example.
No worries, you can study a bit more because it's so really interesting. I'd like to hear more.
This is, thank you. This is I've just skipped over a couple of slides from W.G. Sebald, who's a German writer who talks about writing about the Holocaust and about using a form of fiction to extend the human reality of what it must have been like to have been human then. But I want to give you, I'll finish with this example. This is the Canadian poet, Anne Carson. And if you don't have this box, get it. You get it for £30 on Amazon. It's a box. It's called Nox. Nox is Latin for night. And it's a box which, as you can see, opens up like this, so that you've got two sides to the page, like a concertina. And on one side, Anne Carson, this very well-known Canadian poet, writes her experience of translating a Latin poem. And on the other side, she keeps a diary of what it's like to be Anne Carson. So it's the two things are read together, her work as a translator and her work as a human being. So she's already thinking about the flow between these two elements. The poem in question is Catullus 101. It's called Catullus 101. Multas per gentes, it's sometimes known as. I'm sure that as contemporary scholars, you can all read Latin. So I don't need to translate it, do I? Sorry. So it's a poem about the poet going back to the funeral of his brother. His parents can't go to the funeral, and he's going to the funeral, and he's brokenhearted. And he's thinking, how am I going to cope with this? We can all identify with that. Here's one translation. Here's the normal translation most people call this. This isn't Anne Carson. This is the most common one. Carried through many nations and over many seas, I arrived, brother, for these wretched funeral rites, so that I might present you with the last tribute of death. and speak in vain to silent ash, since fortune has carried you yourself away from me. Alas, poor brother, unfairly taken from me. But all of that's pretty straightforward. But then we come to 3 lines in orange and in red. So the lines in red are a different translation of the lines in orange. Now, in the meantime, nevertheless, these things which in the ancient custom of ancestors are handed over as a sad tribute to the rites. And I don't understand that. I don't know what that's about. Let's read another translation. Now, though even these, which from antiquity and in the custom of our parents have been handed down, a gift of sadness in the rites. And that doesn't take me any closer. And Anne Carson writes about this. She says, I can't get into this. I can't make any sense of this. And then, just as she's anguishing over these lines of poetry, she hears that her brother has died. And he's died in Denmark. And her parents can't go to the funeral. So she has to go to the funeral. And she lives this poem. So that her translation flows from the feeling of the original poet, Catullus, to her. And here's what she puts. Let's read the whole thing. Many the peoples, many the oceans I crossed. I arrive at these poor brother burials, so I could give you the last gift owed to death and talk, why, with mute ash. Now that fortune tore you from me, you, O poor, wrongly, brother, wrongly taken from me. Now still, anyway, this, and here are the lines. What a distant mood of parents handed down as the sad gift for burials. And that gets it. The tragedy, the sadness, the horror of a parent burying their child. Of course, that's what it's about. And she gets it very, very neatly, very cleanly, except soaked with tears of a brother and into forever brother, farewell and farewell. Beautiful poem, but it's a translation. And if that poem doesn't touch you, I'm surprised, because it has all of the qualities of presence and absence rolled into it as a translation. I was going to give you some other examples, but I won't, because I know you have a break now, and I don't want you to end up hating me. So I'll finish in the next two. I'll finish in the next 2 minutes. When we think about presence and absence, what we're trying to do, I used the phrase earlier on about created relation. What we're trying to do is to create portals of contact between that which was and that which is. But those portals of contact are about not saying that which was now is. It's about creating something which allows us to travel across the apparent frontiers, the apparent borders of time itself. Translation gives us the opportunity to travel across time in the same way as the Museum Without Walls provides the arena in which that timeless travel, that reabsorption into tradition gives us. In his wonderful book, Deconstruction and the Other, and really, if you're going to read about translation, you've got to read Derrida and you've got to read Ricoeur. You've got to. Derrida says simply this: neither this nor that, but rather this and that. Translation is about not turning our back on absence, but incorporating the conditions of absence, which after all are our own ontological conditions, incorporating them into our way of being now, so that the act of translation itself becomes an embodiment of here and there, this and that. That is what we might call the ethics of creativity. You can see that in terms of, for example, a refusal to choose between this absurd binary, because it is an absurd binary, of domestication and foreignizing. It's not a real choice. Domestication and foreignizing are two sides of the same coin. And, you know, Larry Venuti would argue that very, very strongly. If anyone has ever been traduced as a theorist, it's probably Venuti. To really get to the heart of this, I would recommend, this sounds like a contradiction in terms, but he's an Irish philosopher, Richard Kearney. And Kearney writes about Derrida and Ricoeur and really gets us into the heart of what it might mean to work as translators and undertake the sort of ethics or ethical creativity that both recognizes presence, recognizes absence, and tries to undertake a radical renegotiation between them both. Now, that takes us into the very heart of what it means to be human. And translation, I would hope, as you undertake your very, very specific projects, you will see that you're undertaking you're working within a field which lies at the very heart of what it means to be a human being in a world that we're constantly interpreting and representing and seeking to represent without being constrained by it. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to those who are online as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
Sorry, I'm 2 minutes late.
No. It's all right because we start slightly late anyway. So could we perhaps invite just maybe a couple of questions?
Oh,
if there anyone have any questions? Yes.
Saihong, I have a question for. Sorry, I have a question. Oh, sorry, Ian Tian. Hold on. Let me just unmute you. Okay. Hold on. Let me just.
Okay.
And okay. Ian Tian, you can. Yes.
Yes. I think I'm okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Thank you, David, for another brilliant talk.
Thank you, Tian. Welcome to Stirling, Tian.
Thank you. Yeah.
Virtually, yes.
Yeah. So my question actually directs to I think a hint of Eurocentrism in not only your talk but in most of the translation studies nowadays. So you talk about death, and you said that many of the materials that you cite has some religious hint in it, even though they try their best not to talk about religion. But I still feel like these theories come from a sense of Christianity. So you for example, you talk about Benjamin's death and life, and you talk about the conditioned by death. That's very Heidegger. But if you think about some, let's say, Eastern philosophy like Taoism or Buddhism, they have very much different path towards death. And that may lead us to a quite different way of seeing afterlife. And more practically, you talked about 戏曲, and as that article you published with Lisa, you said that to the Chinese way of protecting the uniqueness may lead to the containment of the spread of 戏曲. But you use the metaphor of flow, but I think flow suggests some way of gravity, that something is drawn towards a more powerful centered place. So that again puts the power relation between a weaker Chinese and the stronger English users group to the question. And finally, the recent case, about Rushdi's being attacked, again puts further question to a assumption, I would say, to a universal, especially imposed on the social science and humanities.
The short answer is yes. I think you're raising all sorts of as always, I think you're raising all sorts of interesting points, Tian. In terms of religion, I don't think religion is a universal, but I think it's a very, it's endemic in many of our cultures and civilizations. Jean-Paul Sartre of the West said that there's a hole the shape of God in our world. And when you have no God, when you have nothing that gives you, as is my case, and in a way, I'm talking from my case and trying to illustrate my case through a range of examples, rather than seeing myself as some sort of metonym, either for the West or for any sort of point of contact with the East. But when you have no God, then you look for other things, I think. Some of those things can be material substitutes, so that a common example of that a lot of people talk about is tourism as a substitute for pilgrimage. For me, translation offers a form of something outside and something bigger than myself that I do. And I think that's probably as far as I could go with that. Translation plugs us in to something which lies at the heart of what it means to be human, and lies at the heart of what human beings have been doing across centuries. And it actually angers me when translation studies takes translation over and reduces it, where translation itself becomes a metonym for the discipline. Translation is much bigger than that. But in terms of Rushdie and Salman Rushdie, clearly there is a huge ethical issue there as well, which, if we were involved in a translation studies discussion of it, would involve freedom of speech, but it might also involve politics of recognition. So we would have to discuss it in a very complex way. That doesn't really answer all the wonderful points that you made, Tian, but thank you for that. There was somebody here who's going to.
Okay, and sorry, I have a question. Professor Johnston, first of all, thank you so much for giving this talk. You mentioned Slavoj Žižek in your talk, which is very interesting because I'm going to apply his theory in my PhD research in the upcoming month. And I'm reading his book recently, and I watched his documentary, which is The Pervert Guide to Ideology. He mentioned about subject of pleasures and subject of duties. So do you think, is there any rooms for applying Slavoj Žižek theories of ideology in the translation studies? And this is my first question. And the second question is, we have terms called translatability and untranslatability. So in Žižek's term, I think you probably know about surplus enjoyment in Žižek's theory. So do you see untranslatability as a kind of surplus enjoyment? Because we know there are certain things that cannot be translated, but we need to translate it to make it translatable. Is this a kind of like a surplus enjoyment in your view?
Okay, there's lots of things there. First of all, good luck with Slavoj Žižek. Slavoj Žižek is primarily concerned to be an enfant terrible and is full of all sorts of wonderful contradictions. There's Žižek lives too much and feels too intensely to be the embodiment of a theory. Certainly lots of things that he says are relevant to translation studies, but then translation itself is relevant to everything. So you can certainly look at Žižek in terms of what he means for translators. In terms of the untranslatable, I think that's a very interesting point. Translation itself, it was Derrida that said everything is translatable and nothing is translatable, meaning by that we can't simply go to a text and translate it for no reason. There must be a purpose for translation, and that purpose itself will be centrally communicative. That purpose itself will be centrally to do with establishing the sort of created relation that I was talking about earlier on. The pleasure of the untranslatable, that's a different matter. And I don't know if you've come across the work of the Brazilian theorist Viveiros de Castro, because he talks about the rights of untranslatability, and in fact the way in which an untranslated text should be savored in its own terms. So there are issues to do with the untranslatable as well that Zizek, that Slavoj Zizek picks up on and develops. And I think it's a really interesting perspective. But the untranslatable doesn't exist in binary opposition to the translatable. The untranslatable, like the photograph that Berger talks about, is a decision to leave rather than a quality of text itself. The translatable and the untranslatable are not qualities of text. They are decisions. And as decisions, they open up different perspectives on those texts. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thank
Sorry.
you. No, it's okay. I'm delighted.
Well, thank you so much, Professor David Johnston. It's such a wonderful talk. Well, given the time we have, because we have to move on to the next one, so I hope you're okay that we stop here now, and we will have 3 minutes break. So if anyone would like to have some coffee and tea, so please help yourself. And then in the meantime, we'll set it up here. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody.